Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
Historical Interpretations on Coming into Power. History has seen many brutal and ruthless leaders, and the 20th century has certainly had its fair share. Vladimir Lenin, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Stalin, Francisco Franco, Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Fidel Castro are just some of the many rulers of single-party states who have held power during the 20th century. There are countless more. In this episode, we will try to apply a set of historiographical schools of interpretation to three different rulers of single-party states and their ways towards power. The three rulers are Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Fidel Castro. The schools of historical interpretation will largely be the same for each ruler in order for us to see the similarities and differences in their way into power. The most fundamental school is the structuralist/intentionalist debate. The structuralists, also known as functionalists, will focus on those political and military structures in the society which will have opened the way and allowed the ruler to obtain power. The intentionalists will focus on the will, abilities and intentions of the ruler, often claiming that the ruler was destined to come to power, to save a struggling society and bring it back to glory. The structuralist-intentionalist arguments have their origin in an essay written by British Marxist historian Timothy Mason in 1981. The essay was about the Holocaust and to what extent the Holocaust was caused by Hitler's intentional desire to exterminate the Jews, or to what extent this extermination was the product of the whole structure of the National Socialist state. We will apply the notion of structuralism and intentionalism to respectively the societies and the rulers in question. In addition, we will make use of the Hegelian and Marxist schools of interpretation. Hegel was a German philosopher who wrote in the early 1800s. He believed that a society was the result of the collective spirit or thoughts that a people had. If the people or citizens started changing their ideas about society, their collective thought would serve to change the society to fit with these thoughts. Hegel also believed that sometimes there would be one individual who embodied this whole spirit of a people or a nation and could thus lead them in changing society to fit with their ideas. It is obvious that some aspiring leaders might think that they would be this particular individual. The Marxist interpretation also revolves around changes as a society develops. But Karl Marx focused on the economy as the driving factor. Marxism and communism originated in the late 1800s when industrialization was creating a small, wealthy upper class who employed a large working underclass. Marx believed that the working class were exploited by the capitalist, factory-owning upper class. When the workers were finally fed up with their situation, they would create a revolution and begin a communist society in which no one owned more than others, and everyone was considered equal. For Marx, there was no designated leader of this revolution. That did not come about before Lenin in 1902 laid the foundation to what is called Marxist-Leninism. Lenin proposed that a small group of elite professional revolutionaries might force through the revolution on behalf of the working class. Communism would then follow. Let us see how it would be possible to interpret each of the three leaders' ascent into power. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists spent 14 years working their way towards the power of Germany. From 1919 to 23, they were revolutionary. From 1924 to 33, they used democratic means, gathering votes. And from 1933, when Hitler had been appointed Chancellor, they used legality, the making of laws, to eliminate opposition and make themselves stronger. A structuralist, intentionalist frame of interpretation seems the most fitting, especially as these schools of interpretation really came about with Timothy Mason's essay on the Holocaust in 1981. A Hegelian interpretation of a special leader would also be fitting, especially seen from Hitler's own point of view. The intentionalist argument would be that Hitler from the beginning had the plan, the ideas, and the intention of coming into power. This would be supported by Hitler's autobiography and political manifesto, Mein Kampf, which he wrote in 1924 while sitting in Landsberg prison after the failed Munich beer hall putsch of revolution in November 1923. Hitler made no attempt to hide the fact that he was out for the dictatorial power of Germany, that Germany needed a strong leader, him, and that once in power, he would wage war against the East European states and against communist Russia. Intentionalists would also argue that Hitler was able to switch the methods of the Nazi Party's attempts at grabbing power from a revolutionary to a democratic strategy. The structuralists or functionalists, on the other hand, would focus on the political and military situation of Germany at the time. Germany had just lost World War I and had been forced to pay huge reparations and to reduce its army. People had no trust in the new democratic Weimar Republic, and President Ebert struggled to control the right-wing paramilitary fighting groups and the left-wing communists. After Hitler had been thrown in jail and America began lending money to Germany to rebuild its industry, the Nazis lost most of their influence. During the years 1924 to 29, only 2.6% of the population voted for the Nazis. People were making money again and became more satisfied with the Weimar government. It was only when the Wall Street crash in 1929 caused the stop of American aid, leading to huge unemployment, that people were willing to again listen to Hitler and the National Socialists. When appointed Chancellor, Hitler really made use of the structure of the Weimar system, creating laws to make himself stronger and the opposition weaker. Thus, for structuralists, it would be the political and military structure, the fact that people lost faith in the Weimar government, which in turn did not have soldiers to protect the citizens, which led them to vote for Hitler. Hitler himself would have been staunchly intentionalist in his interpretation of the events. Hitler would have claimed that from the beginning he made his intentions clear and that destiny was on his side, aiding him and his party in fulfilling the destiny of Germany. Hitler would also have been a Hegelian in that he saw himself as the embodiment of the German people, the leader and savior who was destined to bring Germany to greatness. Some historians have gone as far as calling Hegel, who lived 100 years before Hitler, the father of Nazism. As we can see, intentionalists would focus on Hitler's clear intentions of taking power over Germany as written in Mein Kampf and demonstrated through the changes in power-grabbing strategies. Structuralists would focus on the general lack of faith in the Weimar Republic and its leaders and the power vacuum it created. And Hegelians, here the Nazis themselves, would emphasize Hitler's role as the embodiment of Germany, the savior and leader. What one decides is up to oneself, but care must be taken to always consider two sides of an argument in order to make it balanced. Stalin's way into power is considered here for two main reasons. One, that he was contemporary with Hitler, being Hitler's great opponent in World War II. And two, that he was revered as the great helmsman of the communist revolution and thus should be considered in a light of Marxist interpretation. Again, we will begin with the most basic frame of interpretation, the structuralist-intentionalist debate. If we can call a method by a name of a historiographical school, Stalin used both structuralist and intentionalist methods in order to come to power. Unlike Hitler, Stalin became leader and dictator through secession, not through him and his political party grabbing power. When Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was just one of several people who might be considered for becoming Lenin's successor as chairman of the Communist Party. He therefore had to outmaneuver several more capable or at least more popular rivals within the top echelon of the Communist Party, the Politburo. Stalin did this by switching opinions and betray his friends. In 1925, Stalin outmaneuvered fellow Politburo member Leon Trotsky by siding with members Zinoviev and Kamenev on agreeing to keep the so-called NEP, the New Economic Policy, despite the fact that it was based on capitalist principles. In 1926-27, with Trotsky out of the way, Stalin flip-flopped. He turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, accusing them of being capitalist reactionaries. They later ended up in jail. Stalin then instigated his own policy and the 5-year plans, which kept running the Soviet economy until its collapse in 1991. Stalin's intentionalism in becoming undisputed leader would not be interpreted from a manifest such as Hitler's Mein Kampf, but from the ruthlessness with which he outmaneuvered friends, purged and executed rivals, and removed them from the history and photographic evidence of them ever having existed. How can Stalin's methods be interpreted as structuralist then? That would be through his use of the communist state and party structure in gaining political supporters. In 1923, he had become General Secretary of the Communist Party. The position held little prestige. He was in charge of the paperwork. But Stalin used his position to appoint only those most loyal to him personally to important posts within the party structure. When the Communist Party opened up for new members during the so-called Lenin enrollment of 1923-25, Stalin used this process to admit over 100,000 people into the party who owed their new membership mainly to him. Stalin is thus a prime example of a person who used the political structure within his society for the very personal gain of power. Finally, we cannot attempt to interpret Stalin's way into power without using the Marxist school of interpretation. But we see how his ascent to power had nothing to do with revolution or changes in society. How could his positioning of himself as leader then be interpreted in a Marxist light? Stalin did this not by claiming to take over from Lenin in a more communist way than before. Instead, he claimed to be the best in continuing the communist revolution, maintaining it in the spirit of Lenin. And Lenin had written about a small elite group of professional revolutionaries who would spearhead the revolution on behalf of the people. As we can see, Stalin's ascent into power can be interpreted as him making the most of all channels available to him. If seen from a structuralist viewpoint, he used the Communist Party structure to appoint followers. From an intentionalist perspective, he was ruthlessly willing to destroy anyone or anything in his way towards undisputed leadership. And from the prevailing Marxist viewpoint of his time, Stalin took care to make it clear that he was not changing the revolutionary prospects of Lenin, but keeping them going. While the use of Marxist historical interpretation is straightforward, it should be made clear that intentionalism and structuralism in interpreting a leader's way into power may be a stretch. One should always make it clear that the structuralist-intentionalist debate came from a discussion over the Holocaust and has been adapted. Nevertheless, it is a surprisingly snug fit. Finally, we will turn to Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. Seen from an outside perspective, Castro's way into power can be interpreted as a mixture between the intentionalist, structuralist, Marxist, and Hegelian schools of interpretation. Basically, his way into power can be interpreted as incorporating elements from all the 4 schools of interpretation used in this investigation. Castro's methods of coming into power and the history of the events leading to this surprisingly mostly resemble those of Adolf Hitler. Hitler used revolution, went to prison, used democracy, and finally legality. Castro used democracy, then revolution, went to prison, revolution, civil war again, and finally legality. But after 2 years in power, Castro proclaimed himself and Cuba Marxist and merged his own July 26th movement with the Cuban Communist Party. He then set Cuba on the course of communism, allying his country with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Let us see how all this connects to the schools of interpretation. Castro's intent on coming into power seems obvious. Although he did not write a neat manifesto in his youth to make it easy for us to see, his shifts between methods of coming into power implies an intent stronger than a political doctrine for taking power. Castro first tried getting elected for the Cuban parliament in 1952 as a candidate for the Ortodoxo party. This failed, and in 1953 he attempted a revolutionary takeover of the Moncada military barracks. After having used the same defense in his trial as Hitler did in 1923, that history would absolve him, Castro spent time in prison. He then orchestrated a large guerrilla uprising from the Sierra Mountains before triumphantly entering Havana as a new leader in 1959. From 1959 to 1965, Castro used legality as a means to crush opposition and securing his own power, also as Hitler had done in 1933. In 1961, he declared himself a Marxist, allying Cuba with the Soviet Union. The fact that Castro seemed oblivious to the measures he used and blatantly switched political ideology as he came closer to ruling Cuba implies an intentionalist approach. But the intentionalist argument is countered by a structuralist one. Cuba was poor and to some extent exploited by the USA in the form of American companies and the American mafia. This was possible because Cuba was ruled by military dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro, presenting a forceful and credible people's alternative to Batista rule, gathered supporters from many levels of Cuban society. Thus, the previous structure of Batista's dictatorship and resentment towards the USA supported Castro in his revolutionary claim to power. In addition, the claim of wanting to liberate Cuba from foreign economic exploitation and restoring land ownership from foreign-owned sugar plantations to Cuban peasants justifies a Marxist interpretation. According to Marxist philosophy, Castro was doing only what was considered natural in the development of human society. Castro was trying to end capitalist exploitation and bring Cuba into the stage of a communist egalitarian zenith of human development. Interestingly enough, the people who were at the first most skeptic towards Castro's Marxist leanings were the Soviet communists. Perhaps they viewed his quest for power more through an intentionalist perspective. Castro himself would probably subscribe to a Hegelian interpretation. Claiming always to champion the Cuban people, to embody the spirit of the Cuban nation, Castro portrayed himself modestly as a soldier who just did what he had to do. But was he then supported by intellectual or mass movements in the general society? To some extent, yes, and he definitely was in the beginning. When Fidel Castro and his Fidelistas, as his soldiers were known, entered Havana on January 2nd, 1959, masses of people flocked to cheer them and to hear Castro speak. As we have seen, Fidel Castro, more than the other leaders, can be said to have incorporated elements from all the schools of interpretation which we have attempted to apply to this investigation. His intentions on achieving power is illustrated in his changes of tactics, even political ideologies, as his goal came closer. The structure of the Cuban society, with a hated military dictator, opened up the way for a revolutionary people's alternative. Marxist interpretation would favor Castro's goal of liberating the Cuban people from foreign capitalist exploitation, while a Hegelian interpretation would champion the support Castro gained from the masses. As always, it is important to present several viewpoints in order to create a balanced argument. In conclusion, we see how the historical schools of interpretation can be used to evaluate the means, methods, and circumstances for how leaders of single-party states came into power. The structuralist-intentionalist debate is useful for assessing whether a leader can be said to have forced through his ambitions by his own desire, or whether circumstances in society opened up a channel for him to rise towards leadership. The intentionalist argument is also useful for investigating to which degree a leader would be focused mainly on the power itself, disregarding ideology, political methods, and allies as mere pawns on the way to achieving it. The Marxist interpretation is especially useful when assessing actual Marxist leaders, and we see how some leaders can be said to have worked within a Marxist framework, while others seem to bend the Marxist ideals to suit their personal agenda. The Hegelian school of interpretation is a useful measure on the degree to which the leader can claim to have had intellectual or mass appeal from the citizens. As always, the most important thing is to make up one's own mind, supported with reliable historical evidence, and to present several arguments to reach a balanced conclusion.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century History Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro and throughout this episode was made by Andrea LaRose. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.